All right, guys, I hope you're ready. We're going to talk about Kerberos. We're going to talk about delegations, tickets, a lot of tickets. My name is Darryl Baker. I am a security consultant with Trimark Security. I am the resident purple teamer there. I am the original creator of Active Directory Hacking Village, which is now kind of been rebranded as Identity Security Village. So if you ever see that at any of the conferences, step right up and see if you can test your chops and hack your way into a domain controller. So I break windows for a living. So we're going to talk about Kerberos authentication. We got to start from the basics and kind of work our way forward because there's a lot in this. So we're going to start off with Kerberos authentication. Then we'll move on to types of Kerberos delegation. We'll get into some of the trending Kerberos delegation attacks, as well as one really new framework that's out, Kerb Relay Up, some delegation behavior across Active Directory trusts, as well as delegation behavior in hybrid joined Active Directory environments, and mitigations, of course. We always have to end with mitigations. All right, so what is Kerberos? So Kerberos is a ticket paradigm-based authentication protocol. And what it allows for two parties to do is it allows two trusted parties to communicate over an untrusted network. It uses a third-party trusted host, typically a domain controller. However, Active Directory is not the only systems or configuration that can use Kerberos. It is the preferred authentication method for Windows in a domain-joined environment. However, NTLM is also quite prevalent. You'll fall back to Windows, to NTLM and Windows domains if Kerberos is not configured on one of the clients or not the host. If it's a Windows machine that is not domain joined, or for instance, let's say you've got a Linux box, you've got a Kali box or something like that, that's in an environment, NTLM is going to be your friend. But Kerberos is much more secure, and it's quite interesting the way that it works. So let's dig into that a little bit. Kerberos authentication, it typically takes about 6 steps. All right, so in this first step here, you've got a client who's, we're going to say, is going to access some resource on this target resource server, right? So in step 1, the client reaches out and it does an authentication request. And so what happens here is it's going to take the timestamp. It's going to encrypt the timestamp using the hash of its password to encrypt that. All right, so it sends it over to the domain controller. The domain controller knows the password to the client, of course, because it's domain joined. So it's able to decrypt that, and it looks at the timestamp. As long as you're within 5 minutes, that should be good. You should be able to get a ticket granting ticket, and it moves you on to step 2. What is interesting to note is if you are red teaming or you're pen testing or something like that, you're using like a Kali box and you're interacting with a domain controller, you're trying to use Kerberos protocol, maybe for a relay or something like that, you do want to make sure that your local time is set within 5 minutes of that domain controller, or you will get an error for time skewed. It will not work. So if you're ever wondering why your relay or whatever is not working, check your time. All right, so we do the authentication service request. Domain controller says, all right, this is good. Password checks out, time checks out, and that's going to reply back with a ticket granting ticket, right? Also known as a TGT. So the ticket granting ticket by default is good for 10 hours. If you're in part of the protected users group, because I know all of you guys use the protected users group, nobody ever uses it, but you really should. It will drop that down to 6 hours. But that ticket granting ticket, for all intents and purposes, proves who you are anytime that you want to request a service ticket to any resource in the environment. So you don't have to keep authenticating back and forth to the domain controller. So if you want to access this target resource server, you then take your TGT, you drop down to step 3, you present that back to the domain controller, and you say, hey, I want to access this target resource server. Domain controller checks out the TGT, says it's good. I remember you, doesn't care about anything else, and it will send the service ticket. Always. It will always send the service ticket. Doesn't matter. And it's because it's not up to the domain controller at this step whether or not that client has access to the target resource server. So in step 5, the service ticket that the client received in step 4 is going to be presented to the target resource server. The target resource server is going to look at it and say, okay, either this user or the group that this user is part of has access to me or does not. And that's where your permissive or your denies happen with step 6 with your application response. If you notice in the yellow here, we've got step 5.1 and 5.2. So what this is a PAC verification request as well as a PAC verification response. It doesn't always happen, and that's why it's yellow. It's a very interesting thing, but it is important to note, especially if you're working in dev environments, test environments, or other environments where you may have servers that are not currently patched. So let's kind of dig into that. So what the PAC is, it's a privileged attribute certificate. It holds a whole bunch of security information about the client that's requesting access to something. But for all intents and purposes, it's got the SAM account name, it's got the username, but it's also got group membership. So in that first step, when you got that ticket granting ticket, the PAC is encrypted within that. So when you present your service ticket to whatever your target resource is, that target resource server is going to look at the PAC and it's going to say, okay, this is your username and this is your group membership. Maybe you have access based on your username, maybe you have access based on your group. But what's important to note is that if you're, let's say, part of domain admins, if you're in the PAC, if your group membership says you're a domain admin, when you authenticate, you're going to get a logon token as a domain admin for that target resource. The reason I bring this up is because in 2014, Microsoft accidentally disclosed the algorithm for the encryption for PAC. That being said, attackers were able to then modify the PAC and say they're a part of any group that they wanted to be part of. So you could be a standard user, modify the PAC, say I'm an enterprise admin, and for all intents and purposes, that target resource server will give you a logon token as an enterprise admin. That being said, as long as you have servers that have been patched since, 8 years ago, hopefully you guys have them patched by now, that's not really an issue anymore. We do run into it a little bit in test environments and dev environments, but not nearly as big of a deal. So what Microsoft actually did was completely restructured the data structure for the PAC. So you've got the old way that the PAC looked, and now you've got these new OIDs and stuff that exist within this PAC. So there is a registry key that exists on all these servers. You can see most of it. That first word is system, clearly. And by default, it is set to 1. All right. So when it's set to 1, basically all 1 is saying is it's just checking to make sure that you're using the new data structure. All right. If you're not using the new data structure, you're using some old data structure, or maybe it's a corrupt data structure or something that's improperly configured. This is when you go back to that step 5.1. Target resource server says, this isn't right. It's not 2014 anymore. I need you to verify this for me. Domain controller, is this guy good to go or not? Domain controller will then send back a properly configured PAC, and then the target resource server will continue with the authentication as normal. You can enforce this by setting the parameter to 2. And if you enforce this to 2, what happens is that verification step never happens, right? If it's a poorly formed PAC, or if you're using like an older version of the PAC, it's just explicitly denied. You will never get access to that resource until you have a PAC that matches the new data structure. If you have it set to 0, or let's say you've got local admin rights on a server, but you don't have domain admin rights and you're trying to work on a relay next, you can modify registry entries, right? If you were to change this to 0, it will never check the PAC. So you could give it any kind of PAC that exists out there and say that, you're king of the world. And for all intents and purposes on that box, you will be the king of the world. So something good to know. All right. So what is delegation? All right. So as far as Active Directory is concerned, it's a little bit different if you're talking about Open Directory and some of these other things. But when it comes to Active Directory specifically, delegation is basically impersonation. It is the ability for an object to act on the behalf of another object when accessing a resource inside of your environment. That being said, attack vectors everywhere. There are 2 main types of Kerberos delegation. You've got unconstrained and you got constrained delegation. Unconstrained is by far the most risky of the types of delegation that exist. And the reason for this is unconstrained delegation allows for you to impersonate any other object in your environment when accessing any other resource in your environment. The way that this works is in the step 1, when we were talking about authentication and you get that TGT, let's say that you are accessing a web application, and that web application allows you to peruse a file share somewhere, right? So you can upload files to it and you can download files from it. So what we've done in the background is we've given delegation to this web server so that you don't then have to authenticate again to the file server whenever you're accessing the file share. The web server will then go on your behalf and impersonate you in order to access that file share. With unconstrained delegation, when it goes to the domain controller to request a service ticket on your behalf, it's actually going to get your TGT. So if you're looking, even if you break it down to the protocol level and you're looking in Wireshark, you really are that person. You have the ticket as if you're that person. There's nothing outside of your constrained delegation configuration inside of that domain controller that shows that this delegation is happening at that time. It just looks like that user is making a request directly to that file share. So that's something good to note. It's also one of the reasons why this is so risky. So if you've got the same web server, unconstrained delegation is configured on it, and it's compromised by an attacker. Let's say the attacker gets, debug privileges, or it's a local admin. You can use tools like Mimikatz, and you're able to dump all of these TGTs for anybody that's ever logged into this machine out of memory. So maybe you're a local administrator now. Hopefully a domain admin's logged into the server, or maybe some other server admin, but it's definitely a way to laterally move and potentially priv-esque. Here in the middle there where you've got the get AD computer, just a one-liner for PowerShell. It's very easy to find all these objects. So by default, all objects in Active Directory have read-only rights to most attributes to all of the other objects. It's the way that Active Directory works, and it wouldn't be able to work without it. So that being said, finding these types of targets, incredibly easy. One line, and you'll see everything that's there. Best practice is to not have unconstrained delegation configured in your environment. However, there's going to be third-party vendors that are going to tell you that you have to use it. Sometimes there are configurations that do require you to use it, but generally speaking, if you can, the only thing that should have unconstrained delegation configured in your environment are your domain controllers. All right, so let's get over to constrained delegation. So unconstrained delegation came out with Windows Server 2000. Microsoft immediately saw kind of the dangers in that. And so constrained delegation came out with Server 2003. Then in Server 2012, Microsoft actually created these new extensions called S4U, or known as Service for User. And what the S4U does is it allows that web server, again, when it's requesting a service ticket on your behalf, instead of receiving that ticket granting ticket and actually being you, it's getting a ticket that says, I'm delegating, I am the web server, and I'm getting a ticket on behalf of this other user. Makes it much easier for your IR teams, for your admins, and everybody else. What makes constrained delegation different from unconstrained delegation is two big things. The first thing is you can constrain the delegation to a specific service or resource. So instead of being able to impersonate everybody to any resource, you can say, well, you can be everybody, but only when you're accessing this file server. The second piece is that you can constrain it to a protocol, right? So we talked about NTLM still being prevalent around. You can say, no, all we're going to do is Kerberos. So if you try to authenticate to this file server any other way, it's going to automatically fail via this delegation. So with constrained delegation, there's actually three subtypes. Get ready, guys. We're about to get deep. So you've got your standard Kerberos constrained delegation. You've got constrained delegation with protocol transition. And then you've got resource-based constrained delegation, which is the heart and soul of most modern Kerberos delegation attacks. All right. Does my picture show up? Kind of. All right. So if we merge these two, you get the full picture, I suppose. All right. So what's happening here is you've got a user. The user is going to authenticate to that web server. Off screen here is a file server that's there as well. So step one, the user gets their ticket granting ticket as normal, then goes back to the domain controller with the ticket granting ticket and says, hey, I need a service ticket to this web server. All right. So at this point, the web server will then use this new extension, one of the S4Us. And in this particular case, it's going to be an S4U to proxy service extension and request a service ticket on behalf of that client in order to access the file share. One of the main things to note again here, the biggest difference between constrained delegation and unconstrained delegation is here in that second step, that fourth step where you get that S4U to proxy. In unconstrained delegation here, that web server would receive that TGT, the same TGT that the client got there in step two. All right, so constrained delegation with protocol transition, almost as good as normal constrained delegation, but a little bit more risky. It does allow for more flexibility in your environments. And its main use is if you've got a client that's out of band from your domain. So let's say they're coming from the wide open internet, and it's a web facing or an internet facing web server. All right. So some kind of authentication happens. It can be basic, it can be NTLM, doesn't matter. Some authentication happens. This web server is going to use the second of the two S4U extensions, known as S4U to self. And what it's going to do, it's going to request a service ticket to itself on behalf of that user. Then it's going to take that service ticket and it's going to do an S4U to proxy, the same as we did in the last step, in order to access this file share. Now, what is really interesting about protocol transition is those first two steps, that out-of-band authentication is never validated anywhere. So the domain controller, when it gives you that S4U to self, it will always give you that S4U to self ticket because it trusts that authentication happens somewhere. You're on your own there. So if you are able to compromise a machine that does have constrained delegation with protocol transition, you're able to get an S4U to self ticket. And we're going to see why this is important here in a minute. But you're able to get that without that authentication ever happening. All right, so here's the fun one. So resource-based constrained delegation. This one is confusing for a lot of people. So up until now, the delegation has been configured on a domain controller, right? So that web server has gone back to the domain controller with that special service ticket. The domain controller checks to make sure that web server has the ability to delegate. If it does, then authentication continues. With resource-based constrained delegation, that's not the case. This is configured directly on the object itself. There's no checks with the domain controller. It's in an attribute that's directly on that computer object. And in order to modify who can be delegated to that resource is whoever has write privileges to that object. The reason for this is to move the administration away from domain admins and allow for server admins to create delegations on their own to their own services and to their own resources. So it is really convenient, but it's convenient for attackers as well. When it comes to delegation and taking over delegation, a lot of times when you're purple teaming or you're labbing or even if you're red teaming, you kind of bring yourself to this thought of, right, I want to be a domain admin. That's what everybody thinks, right? Domain admin, domain admin, domain admin. But there's actually quite a few things that are much better than a domain admin. For instance, KRB TGT account, the guy that writes all the tickets for everybody. But in my case, if I can be anything I want to be, I'm just going to be the domain controller. I will control all of the delegations. So, all right. So why are delegation attacks a thing? Why do people attack constrained delegations? One main reason is due to SPN modification. So an SPN is a service principal name, and a service principal name is used to identify a security principal under which a service is running in the context. So what that means is every service that you've got out there, every resource that you've got out there, it's got to run under some service account somewhere. All right. And that can be a user, it can be a group, it can be a computer, doesn't matter. So when you create this service account, it gets an SPN associated with it. It's an attribute. Again, PowerShell, one-liner, very easy to see what your service accounts are in your environment. The SPN is made up of really two different sections. Technically, you can have three, but the two sections that are important are the first piece, which is going to be the service class, which is going to say what type of service it is, right? So is it CIFS? Is it, www? Is it hosts? It can be a lot of different things. So the second piece is going to be what the target host is itself. So the SPN allows for you to actually identify not only what service is available on a target resource, but what the target resource's host name is, as well as what services are available on that host. Second piece of this is when we talked about service tickets. Part of the service ticket is encrypted, but part of it is in clear text. When a service ticket is encrypted, it's encrypted again using the password hash of that service account. So that same service account that's got an SPN on it. So this is where Kerberos goes into, but that's a whole other talk. But what's interesting is the unencrypted piece contains the SPN. So you can see that in plain text. And when the service is actually validating whether or not you have access to this resource, it's only verifying the fact that it's able to decrypt the service ticket and the pack. It is not verifying the SPN. So as an attacker, if you go in there and let's say it's a file server that also for whatever reason is hosting web services, you may have an SPN that has the CIFS service class. You're able to modify that to HTTPS, for instance, and that validation will go through. As long as the encryption is good for that service ticket, the validation will go through regardless of what that service class is. So you can jump from something like CIFS to HTTPS and then try to execute remote code via WinRM. Another thing to note is every computer object in Active Directory is going to have two SPNs by default. And that it's going to be to the host class. And that's the only way that network logins happen. So every computer object will have this host service class that's there. And with that, you can use things like psexec in order to execute remote code, probably about 30% of the time. Okay, so resource-based constrained delegation. Like I said, that is kind of the heart and soul of delegation attacks. I would say back in, I think it was 2019, Elad Shamir released Wagging the Dog. I don't know if you guys have read that one. It's intense. It's really cool. He talks about a lot of different ways that delegation attacks can happen and a lot of ways that you can manipulate tickets. But again, at the heart and soul of most of this is going to be at least one computer object that is configured with resource-based constrained delegation. So why? The first reason is that all you need in order to configure resource-based constrained delegation is write privileges to that object. You don't need to be a domain admin. You don't need to be an admin of any sort. You just need to have write privileges to the object that you want to configure this on. That brings us to part two, machine account quota. So out of the box, Active Directory has this cool little thing known as machine account quota that is set to 10. And what that means is any user in your environment can create 10 computer accounts and join them to Active Directory. So even as a standard user, you need no extra permissions. It's a one-liner in PowerShell. You can create a computer object even if the computer doesn't exist and add it to Active Directory. There's actually been research around this, and you can take this a bit further because for each one of those accounts that you create, they'll also be able to create 10 underneath them. So you can actually create 121 objects as a standard user by default in Active Directory. So make sure you drop that number down to 0. Lots of environments that I run into. So I do security assessments in Active Directory for a living. Lots of environments that we run into. This is not set to 0. It's still the default settings. With that being said, as a standard user, you're able to create a computer object that's joined to Active Directory. And now you're the owner of that object. Well, that brings us back to the first bullet. So now I can configure resource-based constrained delegation. And I can say whoever I want can be whoever they want to be when they authenticate to myself, even if I relay it back to myself. And this is where we're going to start getting into some interesting things. All right, so my next slide is going to be a picture of kind of these steps that I'm going to walk you through right here. But it consists of two different machines. You've got one machine that has been compromised. Hopefully you're a local admin, but maybe you're not. Maybe you're just a standard user on it. But that machine has been configured for constrained delegation of any type. Doesn't matter if it's protocol transition, whatever. But it's got constrained delegation configured on it. The second piece is, let's say it's the machine that you've created, or maybe it's a machine that you compromised that just happened to have resource-based constrained delegation on that. So we've got constrained delegation over here. We've got resource-based constrained delegation over there. All right. So what's going to happen is in step one, the attacker is going to configure resource-based constrained delegation and say that the machine that has constrained delegation configured on it can then be whomever they want whenever they authenticate to machine one. All right. We can use a tool like Rubius, right? And we can sit in the middle here from machine one, even though it's not even a real machine. It's just some computer object that's there. It's still an object in Active Directory. Active Directory doesn't care if it's a physical object or if it's a physical machine or not, just cares that it's an object. And you are able to create a service ticket using that S4U to self. And then using that S4U to self, you can, on behalf of machine number 2, say that I want to authenticate to this resource-based constrained delegation machine as a domain admin, and you will get a service ticket as a DA. So there's a lot of words. We said delegation a lot. We said constrained a lot. Bam, pictures. Gotta love pictures. All right, so again, we've got the attacker-controlled machine that's there. And then here in the middle, we've got the machine that we just created, right? It's got resource-based constrained delegation configured on it, and we say that that first machine now can impersonate whoever they want to it. That being said, we're able to request that S4U to self. And again, any object that has an SPN on it can request an S4U to self service ticket, and the domain controller will always give it to you. So you get the S4U to self as a domain administrator, and then you can use an S4U to proxy. And let's say we'll proxy back to host. And now you've logged into this imaginary machine that you've created as an administrator with a legitimate ticket inside of Active Directory. That's kind of the first step. That was a lot of the work that was done with Alad Shamir, Charlie Clark. They spent a lot of time on that. Recently, a new trend has happened. It's Curb Relay Up, or as I like to call it, it's the new kid on the block. It's got all the right stuff. So Curb Relay Up is not just one tool. It is a tool comprised of Rubius, Curb Relay, ADCS Pwn. It's got everything that you would ever need as far as Active Directory manipulation built into it. It's actually quite fascinating. But what Curb Relay Up does is it adds a relay in the middle of that last constrained delegation attack. And what that relay does is it allows for you to relay system credentials back to yourself. And you're able to do that because you're already an admin. There's a lot of different ways that you can coerce an NTLM relay there, but we won't get too deep into the weeds there. But Curb Relay Up, it allows an attacker to go basically from just some standard user to create a new machine in your environment, to become an administrator, and then relay back to yourself, and now you're actually system as well on this newly created object. What is important to keep in mind, though, is an LDAP relay is required for this to happen. Now, when Curb Relay Up was first created about 8 months ago or so, as long as you had LDAP signing and channel binding in place, this would not work, simply because fingerprint wouldn't match and that authentication would fail. Since then, there's been some new additions to this. And if you've got Active Directory certificate services in place, but you're not using the extended protection for authentication, we'll just kind of go the back route and we'll use ADCS the same way that we would for that normal LDAP relay. Another thing to keep in mind too with ADCS, there's been a lot of exploits and vulnerabilities around ADCS recently. But one thing to keep in mind is if you've got an account that gets compromised in your environment and you're also using certificates for authentication, one of the first things that admins do, right, is disable the account, change the password again, right? You go through the whole steps. You also need to revoke that certificate and issue out a new certificate. So changing the password has nothing to do with authentication via certificates. So as an attacker, if I'm clever, I'm also going to try to grab the certificate, but then I'm going to use the password. That way, if my password doesn't work again in the future, that certificate hopefully still will. All right, so Curb Relay Up. The steps are very similar. New machine account gets created, but here we're going to do a little coercion. You can use the PrintNightmare or the print spooler bug in order to coerce another machine to get this system level of access. And so what happens is there's actually a few things you can do. Even with SQL Server, there's a lot of different queries that you can make that will have that machine, then do an NTLM authentication, and it will happen as NT system. So you're just sitting in the middle, you grab that, and then you relay it back to yourself, to this box that you already own as an administrator, and now you become system as well. So Curb Relay Up is really cool. It's out of the box. It's on GitHub. 2 clicks, and you can just own probably 80% of Active Directory environments that I see on a regular basis. So if you guys are into purple teaming or red teaming, I highly suggest check it out. It was created by Mor Davidovich back in February, and I would say about every month they're adding new features to it. Back in 2020, Charlie Clark, exploit.ph, he was doing some really interesting research around what happens with delegation whenever you're going across trusts. And for this specific talk, I'm talking about parent-child trust. We're not talking about external trusts. We're not talking about forced trust, just parent-child trust. And he was able to actually track down the exact steps that happen whenever you need to access some resource that's in another domain. We've got the nice picture here. I'll make sure that this is available, that it'll be available somewhere so that you guys can go over that. But the steps are basically laid out here. Authentication happens in a very typical way, the way that it starts normally, but there's really 4 things that happen in the middle that are a little bit different. So your local domain controller is going to get an S4U to self to the foreign domain controller. It's going to use that in order to get a service ticket on behalf of you for whatever that target resource is. Then we're going to use that service ticket and we're going to go backwards from the foreign to the local. And then authentication happens as normal. Once you have that service ticket that came back from the foreign domain controller, you're able to use that, send it to the foreign domain controller and say, I need to access this print server as domain admin Ted, that will work. So there's a really cool proof of concept done by Charlie Clark here. Did not think it was quite appropriate for me to just redo the exact same thing that he's already done on it, but you can execute remote code across this, and it's really interesting. The reason why I bring this up is because you can have a really well secured environment, one that's really locked down. Your machine account quota is set to 0. You've got LDAP signing that's in place, right? In your prod environment. But let's say you've got that dev environment that's off to the side, that testing environment that you just, you let the kids play in. That's not nearly as secure. Well, we can hop from that dev environment just as any standard user and become a domain admin in your prod environment as well. So it's something to keep in mind that if you do have parent-child domains, and you got these trusts in place, that you want to make sure that that child domain is just as locked down and just as secure as the parent. A chain is no stronger than its weakest link. Okay, so that brings us over to hybrid AD. All right, so Microsoft would have you believe that Azure is the way going forward. There's nothing else that's better than Azure. It's the most secure thing in the world. But realistically speaking, most environments that you run into that are using Azure are hybrid joined in some form or fashion. They probably have an on-premise domain controller somewhere. It may be because of legacy applications. It may be because they can't afford the subscription base, whatever, what have you. I would say that probably a good 90% of the environments, though, that I run into that do have Azure are hybrid joined in some form or fashion. So that being said, if you have an on-premise domain controller and you're hybrid joined, these constrained delegation attacks will still work. So if you've got an Azure VM, but you've got an on-premise domain controller, you can absolutely use curb relay up and exploit one of these VMs. We can take that a step farther. If you've got an actual laptop, you've got a corporate laptop here, right? It's hybrid joined via Intune, right? Cool. I can move both from the cloud to your physical device. I can move from on-prem to your physical device, from the physical device up to your cloud, however you want to look at it. So that's something to keep in mind. So Azure is not as secure as Microsoft would have you think it is, especially when it comes to hybrid join. Another piece to this is a really vulnerable area when it comes to hybrid join accounts. Used to be Azure Active Directory Connect. They've done a lot of things with that recently to make that more secure. I believe now when you set up Azure AD Connect, it does force you to, it creates it on your behalf. It creates a GMSA, a group managed service account. You can change that to a normal service account. I don't know why you would, but you can. And recently, Microsoft released Azure Active Directory Cloud Sync. But this server that's used for this synchronization has both. Typically, it will have replication all permissions for a local account. A lot of times, admins are a little bit lazy. They just drop them in DA. So you find an account on this machine that is a domain administrator. So it's a great account to target. The second piece to it is it's also going to have some kind of an administrative account for your Azure environment as well. So again, this is where making sure you have things locked down. And we're going to get into these mitigations as to what you can do in order to make sure that you're secure in a couple of slides. But the reason I bring this up is because you can have the most locked down Azure environment. If you're hybrid joined and you miss one of these checkboxes, right? You don't deploy that group policy. You don't use a tiering system and treat these types of machines the same way that you would treat your domain controllers. Attackers are they can very easily take over both not just your on-premise environment, but all of your Azure environments as well. When it comes to synchronized accounts, especially with Azure, you want to make sure that any of your administrative accounts, you have to log directly into Azure for that. You don't want any of those to be synced. So you've got things like global admin and Intune admin. You want those administrators to have to log directly into Azure whenever they're using those accounts. You don't want that to be some DA that syncs across and then they pick up another role. I will see that a mile away And I love that. That makes my heart jump when I see those accounts configured that way. One of the reasons why that's so important is because those two roles have the ability to execute code as system out of the box on any of your Azure VMs, as well as any of your hybrid joined computers as well, whether they're physical or whether they're VMs. So that could be your cell phone, that could be anything that you're managing via Intune. Another piece that I have been looking at recently, and I'm currently working on a little side project, is around application proxy. And so what the application proxy does is it allows for you to put a proxy in front of your applications that you have either in Azure or on-premise, and authentication happens through Azure in order to get access back to these applications. What's interesting about it is when you're talking about applications that you're hosting on-premise, if you have two different types of applications. You've got modern apps that use authentication methods like OAuth and that kind of a thing, but then you've got these legacy apps as well. So if you've got legacy apps, they're probably using integrated Windows authentication, which is fine, but that means that this Azure AD proxy has to talk back to a proxy connector. So you get your STS tokens and you do the nice secure Azure authentication on the front end, but here on the back end, that proxy machine has to use constrained delegation in order to impersonate these users when authenticating to these legacy apps. So if you've got one server and 27 applications, I'm definitely going to target your proxy connector, and I'm going to execute one of these types of attacks against it, and I'll have access to whatever these legacy applications are that you have in your environment. It's a really interesting piece there. I have not been able to successfully move from on-premise to Azure, but that's the next step. Out of the box, this proxy is one directional, so it is from the cloud inward. For now, we'll just leave it there. Okay, so we've talked about moving from parent-child, child-parent, as well as a lot of different things that are configured whenever you have a hybrid environment and some of the targets that attackers look for and why they look for them. So what can you do to stop this? I would say immediately, the first two things that you want to do is you want to change that machine account quota to 0. Again, out of the box, that is set to 10. It's going to make it harder for an attacker to find a suitable object that's got resource-based constrained delegation on it. When it's not set to 10, they can just create that object. When it's not set to 0, they can just create that object. You want to enable LDAP signing and channel binding. So LDAP signing, it just adds a signature from the domain controller. So if you try to relay that, the relay is going to break because your signature is not going to match. Channel binding. Channel binding basically combines two levels of the network stack. So it combines your transport layer and your network layer together, and they create a unique fingerprint. So if you try to sit in the middle and you try to relay that, the fingerprint's not going to match. If you're using ADCS, you want to make sure that you've got the extended protection for authentication. And basically all that is that's channel binding for certificates. Just adds another layer of creating this unique fingerprint to make sure that somebody can't man or person in the middle any of these types of attacks. So Microsoft for Defender, or Microsoft Defender for Identity and Microsoft Defender for Endpoint technically can identify all of these attacks. The reason why I say technically is because if really it will identify it if you're using it like the script kiddie kind of way. So if you go to GitHub, you download Curb Relay up, and then you execute it in an environment, Defender for Identity will pick that up immediately because there are very specific steps that happen when this attack happens, right? You get that new object creation. Immediately after that, you get resource-based constrained delegation. Immediately after that, you get this random LDAP query that doesn't have a subject in the field. So there's these things that it looks for. That being said, Defender is really only looking for this stuff to happen both in order and within a certain time period. So if I understand how this tool works, maybe today I create the new object. Next week, I configure it with resource-based constrained delegation, and Defender will not pick that up. But if you got a SIM or you've got a SOAR, you can absolutely create alerts for these things. It really does stick out if you're looking at your Windows logs, which actually brings me to a great segue. Make sure that you've got advanced auditing turned on in your Active Directory environments. And you want to make sure that you're enforcing the advanced auditing. So by configuring it alone and deploying the GPO, you would think that you're good to go. There's actually another setting that exists that says, will actually use these settings that I've now put in place as well. So you want to make sure that you've got advanced auditing that's in place. If you've got a SIM or a SOAR in your environment, you want to make sure that you're looking for, this new object creation. You want to make sure that only, your domain admins or your admins that you have deemed have the ability to create objects inside of your environment. You want to make sure you've got LDAP signing in place. You're looking for random LDAP calls, right? That don't match up. They're calls to services that don't exist in your environment, or they're calls from accounts that don't exist or didn't exist in your environment previously. So it's really easy to pick up these types of accounts and this type of activity. And really, I would say out of the box, as long as you were to move your machine account quota down to 0, you enable LDAP signing, channel binding, and EPA, you're like 95% of the way there as far as securing yourself against these types of attacks. But if any one of those things is not there, I will almost definitely guarantee you that some type of delegation attack is possible within your environment. I do want to say special thanks to all of those guys, a bunch of researchers. Some of them are here, some of them are not. I'm working with a few of these guys, and hopefully in our next talk, we've got some newer things that we're using when it comes to delegation, especially pivoting from on-premise to Azure. I'll open the floor to questions if anyone has any questions.
If anyone has any questions, they've got a hand on front.
What's that?
Have you used WWHF for the local privilege escalation?
Yeah, for WebDAV? Yeah. So that's a great question. So actually in Wagging the Dog by Elad Shamir, he shows you how if you've got a SQL server that you've also got configured with WebDAV, you can coerce an authentication via port 80. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And then you can peruse the file share using the XP Dirt Tree extension.
Hey, Darryl, could you repeat the question as they ask so everyone can hear what that was?
Yeah, he was asking if we've ever used these types of attacks with accounts that have been configured with WebDAV. Yeah, so again, that's also pretty well documented, especially on SQL servers that are configured with WebDAV as well. You can access the local file share using the XP_Dirt tree. Do you have a question too? Yeah.
I think you gave an example.
Yeah. So whenever you make an LDAP request, right? So thanks. So he was asking about LDAP requests that do not have a subject, right? Okay. So whenever you make an LDAP request, you can see this, and I encourage you to look at it in your Windows logs. You can see both the subject of who created the request, the subject of who is making the request, because they're not always the same, depending on if you're doing delegation, what the request is to, and the type of request that's there. When you're using a tool like Rubius, not all that information is in there. And the reason why is because it's not actually required for the LDAP request. All that's required is this is the source and this is the target. This is a properly formed ticket. All the rest of that information is there for event logging and auditing and that kind of a thing. So you'll see this event log, and it won't have any data in it. It'll just say like it came from X user to X service, and there's nothing else in it. It's just completely empty except from a timestamp. So it sticks out immediately, and it's really easy to create a similar around that. Anybody
got a question in the back?
Oh yeah, I'm not gonna be able to hear you. What's up? Can we get him a mic?
If you'd like to come up to the mic up here to ask, and then we'll try and get a wireless mic over here to run around. Right there.
Okay. Oh, thank you for the presentation. I was just going to ask if Microsoft Defender will always catch the delegation attacks.
No, absolutely not. So, like I said, if you're running one of these tools that you download from GIST or GitHub or somewhere else like that, Defender will pick it up. But if you understand how the attacks work, and let's say you're running it out of PowerShell directly or .NET or something else like that, as long as you extend the time period in which you're taking these steps, Defender won't pick it up. And the reason why is because all these attacks, and almost all attacks when it comes to Active Directory, are based around legitimate actions that occur within Active Directory all the time. What is actually flagged is the order of these things that are happening within a specific time period. So if you can manipulate the order, or you can manipulate the time period in which you execute that. Defender will not pick it up. But if you do have your own SIM or your own SOAR, you can create custom alerting rules that will always pick up specific things, because as an administrator, you should know both who has the ability to create objects, who has the ability to make specific types of LDAP requests, who has the ability to delegate, and so on.